Okay, so what we're going to talk about today is just a couple basic Excel functions. We're looking at a data set here that I got, excuse me, from Open Baltimore, which is Baltimore City's open data portal. This is from a data set called BDP Part 1 Victim-Based Crime. Um, and so it's just crimes that involve victims in Baltimore City. There's a lot of them. I filtered it down to just include robberies that happened in 2019, and I did that right on the Open Baltimore site and just downloaded a small slice of data from there. Um, I think Open Baltimore has changed a little bit since I downloaded this. I believe that this database is now under a new data set on Open Baltimore called Crime Data, which is structured slightly differently. But this is the slice we're going to look at for this exercise. Um,
Adam, I don't think you're recording.
Oh, I'm recording with a different program called
Oh,
Camtasia.
okay.
Yeah, so it lets me
Okay,
like edit it and stuff in a different way.
gotcha. Just wanted to make sure.
Thanks, Rachel. I appreciate it. Um, and so, yeah, so this is the basic data set. I did a couple things. I'm not sure if Sean went over this with you guys in his workshop or not. I'm assuming he did. Just a couple things that I always do when I download a spreadsheet. This is just a CSV. So I froze and bolded the top row, right, so we can sort of scroll down and see what we've got. I added a column in the beginning called ID, so every single row has a unique ID. And I added a column on the end called end, just to let me know this is the end of my spreadsheet. Um, the other things that I always do when I look at a spreadsheet that I just downloaded is just sort of take a look at what data we have and what the different columns are and what I do and don't understand. So this has crime date, crime time, crime code, location, which is looks like it's a street address, which since these are all in Baltimore City, we know that these are all Baltimore, Maryland. It has a description, which they're all going to be different types of robberies. I know just from working with this before, it breaks down into 3 or 4 different categories that we'll see in a second. Tells us whether it's inside or outside, and we can see this says it's I or O. Tells you if it has a weapon, and it breaks it down. I believe, again, we'll see in a second, it's like by firearm, knife, or other. It tells you the post, which I don't really know what that means. My guess is that's some sort of police code. So one thing that you can do, and that you should do, is sort of any data in a spreadsheet you don't understand, you ask about, right? So Baltimore City has a public information officer, PIO, that always responds if you email him questions about public data. So that's something that I would do. Is I would sort of email and ask any questions I had. Next is district, which Baltimore is broken down into northeastern, southeastern, central, etc. There's a number of districts. It has neighborhood, then it has lat long, something called location, which seems to be pretty empty. It has something called premise, which looks like it's a descriptor of specifically where it happened. Something called VR1 name 1, which I don't know what it means. Total incidents, which again I would probably ask about, but just from working with this data before, I know that it means the total number of crimes or incidents that happened in this specific row, and then our end category. And the other thing I might look at is like, does this data need to be cleaned in any way? We're not going to need to clean it for our purposes today. Does this data, is it mappable? And then in this case, it is, excuse me, it looks completely mappable. We've got not only an address, but lat and long, which is fantastic. Is there other geographic information that we might have that might be interesting? In this case, excuse me, there is kind of lots of geographic information that's interesting because we have district and particularly neighborhood, which looking at specific neighborhoods in a city can be really interesting. And then, finally thinking about what data might be interesting to you. So what I really wanted to show today is how to do pivot tables, which I'm guessing Sean touched on a little bit. But when I learned pivot tables in Excel, the world of data really like opened up to me, and you can do a tremendous amount with pivot tables. And so the idea is we download a data set like this, and we have what's called raw data, right? It's just a row of information for each incident that happened. And so you can't do it, as far as graphics go, we can't do a tremendous amount with this, right? We could map it, but even then, like, it's got, I think it's got like 5,000 entries on here. So even mapping it would be like not super useful. I think in 2015 I did a map of all the robberies in Baltimore, just to sort of make a point that there were a lot of them for a story for the Sun, and like it's basically the entire city is like covered in dots, so not super useful. So what we want to make graphics is what we call summarized data, right? So to get from raw data to summarized data, we can use something called pivot tables. So I'll just show you guys how to do a couple. So we'll go to Insert. And you can do this in Google Sheets. I like to use Excel because it's got a little bit stronger pivot table functionality. So we'll just click Pivot Table. And it's asking us, like, do we want to use the entire range of the table? You can see it, like, outlined everything. And we do. And it's, saying, do you want to put it in a new tab, which I do. Okay, so I click Insert Pivot Table, and it opens up a new tab and shows me this pivot tables information for me to work with. Okay, so we can create tables that basically summarize the data for us, and we've got columns, rows, values, and filters. And what we can do is, so this is showing us all of the columns of our data here, and we can drag them down into these different areas, and it'll summarize it for us. So for instance, let's take a look at description, and this is going to show us, we'll make a column for description. And so this is creating a column in our table for each of the values that was under description, which is description of the crime, which are all the different types of robberies, right? So it's showing us carjacking, commercial, residential, and street. So these are the 4 ways that robberies are categorized in the data. And now we can cross-reference another category by dragging it down to rows. And in this case, we'll work with crime date. And this is something nice that Excel does that Sheets doesn't do, is it actually will break it down into months for us. So it's given us, in rows, a month, and then we can also drop down the months to see specific days. And now we just have to bring something down into value. So it's basically asking me, like, what do you want me to count? And what we want to know is, like, how many robberies there were in each of these days or months. So we're going to pull down description because that's there's a single row for each crime, right? We could also do that total incidents tab, but we'll just use description. So now it gives us a count, and you can change like what the value is. Luckily for the default, it gave us count, which is just counting the number. So how many commercial robberies were there in January? How many carjackings were there in January? You could also get this to do some math for you. You could click this I button, and it would let you do sum or average or max, etc. Usually I'm just doing count, but sometimes sum is helpful too. Right, so now we have summarized data from our spreadsheet, right? How many carjackings took place in January, how many took place in February, right? The total robberies in each of these months. And we can also start dropping down specific days. So this is really useful to sort of help us summarize our data.
What does Sheets do if it doesn't do the months?
It just shows you every single specific day.
So there's no, like, it doesn't show the total.
Exactly. You'd have to do another operation, like in your main spreadsheet,
for like total.
Yeah, to categorize each. Like you could add another column here and give it the month name. So you could say like all these would be January, and the next ones would be February, and then you could count those basically. So that's really the only thing that I'm going to show you that's different between Excel and Sheets is this months thing. So let's get rid of these, which I can do just by dragging them out, and we'll look at a couple other things. So let's look at crime by district, which is something you might want to know if you were writing a story. So we'll drop district down into rows, and so now we're seeing how, which district had the most of each of these types of robberies and by total. And if we click up here on row labels, it'll let us sort of sort it by ascending and descending, so we can look at the most and the least, which would be interesting if you were sort of writing a story. You can analyze the data a little bit more. Okay, let's get rid of district, and I'll show you guys a couple more complicated pivot tables. So let's bring down date again. And now let's add a filter. We'll add district as a filter. So if we bring that here, right now it adds a little filter button up at the top, and we can actually look at robberies over time in each specific district just by clicking this. So we could select none, and then we could start saying, okay, what about in the central, right? Or what about in the northeastern, right? Or we could look at a couple districts at the same time, right? So now it's getting a little bit more powerful, and it's really allowing us to analyze our data in more meaningful ways. Okay, the last thing I want to show you is, I'm going to pull this out. So now we'll look at crime by neighborhood, which is nice. Let's get rid of our filters. Okay, so now, in Baltimore, there's a lot of neighborhoods. Oftentimes when we were writing stories for The Sun, this is how we would sort of break things down. Would be looking at which neighborhoods had, we're going up or down in crime or had the most specific crimes or things like that. So this sort of shows you that, and we can look at them ascending or descending. But we can also add like a third column. If we drag date down to row, it's actually going to add like another level of information for us, right? So now we can look at specific neighborhoods, and we can look at their specific, how crime changed over specific months, or if we drop down, even specific days, right? How many carjackings happened in Allendale on very specific days. So it really lets you like drop down into the information like a lot further. So there's sort of limitless stuff you can do with pivot tables, and the more columns you have, the more you can drill down. So this is really useful for when you have a data set, like you open up something like this and you have 5,000 rows, and you're like, okay, well, this is great data, but what does it mean, right? What's the story here? And I'm sure that Sean in his workshop talked about, okay, developing questions that you want to ask your data. So you come up with your questions, and creating a series of pivot tables is how you can actually, come up with a lot of those answers. If you don't know how to do it sort of programmatically through a program like R. Very easy, very, very quick. You can also do a lot through filtering, which I'm sure Sean showed you guys. I'll just review that really, really quickly. If we're in our main spreadsheet and we click filter, it'll let us filter by any of these columns. And we can actually filter by a couple columns. So for instance, if we wanted to see like all of the carjackings that happened in the central, right, we could break that down, and we would have like a much more manageable sheet, right? So we can look at specifically every single carjacking that happened in the Central District in 2019. And so we can, if we actually want to see little slices of data, filtering can be really, really helpful. Another thing, two more quick things I wanted to show you guys. This is something that I find really useful in Excel, or something called status bar summaries. So if we select a little slice of our data, it's going to show us some information down here, average, count, and sum. So for instance, let's select a column that has a bunch of numbers. We'll do post, even though these aren't necessarily numbers that we would want to add up. If you had a bunch of numbers down here, right, we could select this little slice of numbers, and it's going to tell us, first of all, how many cells we have selected, or rows. In this case, it's 28. It's going to tell us the average of those numbers and also the sum of those numbers. So that's a quick way you can do some really simple math in Excel. We also, yeah, great. Okay, so the last thing I wanted to show you was a quick function. So functions can be very useful in Excel. I'm not sure if Sean went into them or not. It can get really complicated. We're going to do like an exceedingly simple function here. So I'm just going to make a new column, and I'm going to call it carjackings. And I basically am just going to indicate in this cell whether each specific row was a carjacking or was not a carjacking, depending on if the description column, whether that value says robbery dash carjacking or not, right? So I'm going to go to my first cell, and I'm going to type in a function up here, right? And so I do that by putting equal, and I say F2, which is our description column, right? So I'm saying if F2, that cell right there, equals, quote, you need to make sure you get the syntax like exactly right here. So it needs to appear exactly how it does in the cell. So if F2 equals robbery dash carjacking, then I want this cell to say carjacking. And if it doesn't, then I want it to say not carjacking. Right? So this is basically, so if F2 equals robbery dash carjacking, and in the first quote, this is what you want it to return if the answer is yes, and in the second quote, it's what I want it to return if the answer is no. Right? Then I just hit enter. Oh, let's see what my problem is here. I'm actually just going to copy and paste this because I typed something wrong. So this is giving us not carjacking, right? Because this one is robbery street. And what we can do is we can drag this down just by selecting that little corner. You see where there's like a dot there on the corner? I can drag that down a couple cells, and it's just going to copy and paste that down. I can also like double click on that little dot, and it'll just copy it down to the bottom of my sheet. So let's find a robbery that is a carjacking, and we'll make sure this thing's working. Here we go. Yeah, so if we come over here, we'll see it's adding carjacking or not carjacking. So this would actually be useful like in the situation that Amanda mentioned, if we were in Sheets, for instance, and we needed to indicate whether crime happened in January or not, we could write a formula that basically examined like the first number of this crime date, and we could say if it equals 1, then put January here. If it equals 2, then put February. That would be a rather long function, but you could definitely do it. So you could use functions to sort of analyze your data a little bit further.